They say you never truly know who your neighbors are until you stop saying, yes, to everything. And for me, that realization didn't end oppos. T just come with a cold shoulder or a nasty look at the mailbox. It came with two guys wearing plastic badges and a woman whose perfume smelled like a chemical spill in a floor shop. My name is Elias Thorne, and about a year ago, I was just a guy trying to outrun the echoes of a quiet house after my wife, Elena, passed away, leaving me with nothing but a collection of old jazz records and a hollow feeling in my chest that no amount of work could fill. I moved out to Blackwood Creek, a rugged patch of land in the valley that had been in my family since the days when people still used horses to plow the fields, and for a while, the only neighbors I had were the hawks circling the pines and the occasional deer that would wander onto my porch to steal an apple. It was 4 acres of absolute silence, a 1920s craftsman house with a workshop where I could restore vintage motorcycles and pretend the world was and oppos. T moving on without me, but then the world decided to move right into my backyard. A developer bought up the surrounding timberland and, almost overnight, sprouted the ridges of Blackwood, a cluster of 150 carbon copy luxury homes with lawns so green they looked painted and a set of rules so long they could have been the constitution of a small country. I didn't mind them at first, figuring they'd stay on their side of the fence, and I'd stay on mine. But about 6 months in, I heard the crunch of expensive tires on my gravel driveway and saw a white Mercedes SUV parked right in front of my workshop. Out stepped Cynthia Vance, the kind of woman who treats every conversation like a deposition and wears a smile that never quite reaches her eyes, which are currently scanning my vintage Harley parts with the kind of disgust you'd reserve for a crime scene. She didn't oppose to even say hello. She just marched up to me, adjusted her designer sunglasses, and handed me a manila envelope with, notice of delinquency, stamped across it in bright red ink, telling me I owed the HOA $5,000 in back dues and, community improvement levies, I just stood there, wiping oil off my hand with a rag and looking at her like she'd started speaking in tongues, because my land was never part of their subdivision. It was an island of history in a sea of new money, and I told her as much as calmly as I could. I said, Mon oppos. I think you and oppos. You got the wrong house. My grandfather built this place before your developers were even born, and I've never signed a single piece of paper joining your association, But she just gave this little, condescending huff, the kind of sound a teacher makes at a slow student. She told me that when the valley was integrated into the municipal development plan, all existing properties were, grandfathered into the covenant for the sake of community cohesion, and that my, unauthorized workshop activities, were a blight on their property values. It was pure, unadulterated nonsense, a power grab disguised as paperwork. And when I told her to get off my property before I called the sheriff, she didn't oppose. T flinch, she just leaned in, that sickly sweet perfume of hers burning my nose, and whispered, we have friends in high places, Mr. Thorne, and we always get what we want one way or another, A few days later, the real harassment started, and it wasn't just letters anymore. It was a pair of men in navy blue polos and tactical khakis who showed up at my gate while I was halfway through a carburetor rebuild. They had these lanyards with, regional zoning and AMP compliance, printed on them, and they started barking about, illegal industrial runoff, and, unpermitted structures, tapping their fake-looking badges against my wooden gate like they were the FBI. I lived around here long enough to know what a real deputy looks like, and these guys had, mall security, written all over their nervous eyes and the way they kept checking their watches. So I didn't oppose. To give them an inch, I just asked for their supervisor in oppos, S number, and watched them scramble back to their unmarked truck. It was a classic intimidation tactic, the kind of thing you do when you don an oppos. T have a law on your side, but you an oppos. Rebetting the other person is too scared to check. But what Cynthia didn't in oppos, T know, was that Elena had spent 10 years as a paralegal for the county auditor, and I knew exactly where the bodies were buried when it came to land titles and zoning. I spent the next 3 nights in my kitchen, the table covered in yellowed maps, property deed from 1948, and tax records that smelled like damp basements. And that's when I found the first crack in her armor. There was a discrepancy in the recent subdivision plat they'd filed, a tiny little line that didn't end oppos. T matched the historical survey markers, and it felt like a jolt of electricity running through me when I realized what it meant. I didn't in oppos T say a word to anyone, not even to Silas, the old-timer who lived down the road and had been fighting the HOA over his, non-compliant, vegetable garden. I just waited for the next move. And oh, they moved fast, because by the end of the week, I found a crew of landscapers starting to take down my original stone wall that marked my southern border, claiming it was an, eyesore, and that the HOA was installing a uniform cedar fence. I went out there with my phone recording everything, and when Cynthia showed up in a Mercedes to oversee the, improvement, she looked at me with this triumphant smirk like she'd already won, telling me that the board had voted to, reclaim the easement for the community trail. I didn't in oppos. I didn't in oppos. Lose my temper. I just handed her a copy of a fresh land survey I'd had done by a firm 3 towns over, one that used high-precision GPS instead of the sloppy, cut-rate maps her developer had used to save a few bucks. Her face went from that smug, frozen mask to a pale, sickly gray as she looked at the red lines on the map, because the survey didn't end oppos. Just showed that my wall was on my land. It showed that the HOA's brand-new, 3-story, clubhouse and administrative center, the crown jewel of her little empire, was sitting a full 20 feet over the property line. It wasn't oppos. Just on the edge, a significant portion of their grand hall and their entire executive office suite was built on land that legally belonged to me, Elias Thorne, the, blight, they'd been trying to sue out of existence. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a chainsaw, and I just stood there in the dust, watching her hand start to shake, and I said, Cynthia, I think we have a lot to talk about, and you might want to bring your checkbook because the rent on my land is about to go through the roof. But she wasn't oppos, the type to go down without a fight, and that's when things got truly ugly, because suddenly I was getting, anonymous, calls at 3 a.m., and someone spray-painted, get out, across my barn doors. My power got cut twice in 1 week, and the utility company claimed there were, reports of dangerous wiring, that they had to investigate, even though my house had been rewired 2 years prior, and it became clear that Cynthia's, friends in high places, were in oppos. Just a threat. They were a network of local cronies who'd been greasing the wheels for this development for years. I felt like I was being suffocated in my own home. The peace I'd worked so hard to find being ripped away by a woman who viewed my existence as a rounding error on a spreadsheet. And there was this one night where I just sat on my porch, looking at the clubhouse lights glowing in the distance, and I felt a grief for Elena that was so sharp I couldn't in oppos. Breathe, wishing she was there to tell me what to do. Then I remembered something she used to say when she was dealing with a particularly crooked lawyer, if you want to kill a weed, you don an oppos. Pull the leaves, you poison the roots, and I realized I was being too nice by just talking about rent. I reached out to an old contact of Elena's, a retired auditor named Miller who had a memory like a steel trap and a grudge against the developers who'd ruined his favorite fishing spot, and we started digging into the HOA's financial filings and the construction permits for that clubhouse. What we found was a rabbit hole that went deeper than I ever imagined, because Cynthia wasn't an oppos. Just a bossy neighbor, she was running a massive kickback scheme where she'd hire her brother's construction firm for, emergency repairs, at 3 times the market rate, and the HOA dues were being funneled into a shell company that she owned. The reason she wanted me gone wasn't oppos. Just about property values. It was because the clubhouse was built without a proper foundation permit on land they didn't end oppos. Own. And if a real inspection ever happened, the whole fraudulent house of cards would come crashing down our head. I had her pinned, not just for trespassing, but for felony embezzlement and tax fraud, and the feeling of that realization was better than any motorcycle engine I'd ever kicked into life. I decided to play the long game, letting the tension build until the HOA's annual, gala, at the clubhouse, an event where all the local bigwigs and the homeowners were dressed to the nines, sipping expensive wine and celebrating their, perfect, community. I walked in there wearing my grease-stained work jacket and heavy boots, the sound of my footsteps echoing on their polished marble floors as the music died down and 200 people turned to stare at the man who didn't into Oppos. T-Belong. Cynthia tried to have me removed, her voice shrill and panicked as she signaled for her fake security guards. But I just held up a folder and asked the crowd if they knew why their HOA fees had spiked 40% in 2 years while the community pool was still leaking. I started handing out copies of the checks to her brother's firm and the land survey, showing they were currently standing on my private property. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard, a heavy, suffocating realization that the woman they'd trusted was a common thief. The fallout was spectacular. The board was dissolved within 48 hours. The sheriff's department actually had to do their job once the county and Oppos fraud unit got involved, and Cynthia Vance vanished from the valley before the first indictment could even be served, leaving her Mercedes and her reputation behind in the gravel. As for the clubhouse, the new legitimate board had to come to me with their hats in their hands, begging for a long-term lease agreement so they wouldn't and Oppos. T have to demolish half the building, and I didn't in Oppos to make it easy on them. I made them pay for the restoration of my stone wall, the repainting of my barn, and a massive donation to the local hospice center where Elena had spent her final days, and I made sure Silas got his vegetable garden back, plus a seat on the new committee. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evenings, the valley is quiet again, save for the hum of a vintage engine in my workshop, and I look at that big, fancy building on the edge of my land, and I just smile, knowing that every time they turn on the lights in that executive suite, they're doing it on my terms. But here's the thing that still keeps me up sometimes. Even though justice was served, I see the new families moving into those cookie-cutter houses, and I wonder if they even care that they're in quote, perfect in quote. Life was built on a foundation of lies and stolen dirt. People are so desperate for the appearance of order that they'll let a tyrant run their lives as long as the grass is cut to the right height, and it makes me wonder if I'm the hero of this story or just the ghost of a world that doesn't exist anymore. Was I right to tear it all down, or did I just destroy the only sense of community those people had, even if it was a fake one? I'd love to hear what you think. Would you have taken the money and stayed quiet, or would you have set the match to the whole thing like I did? Because at the end of the day, a fence only works if both people agree on where it stands, and in Blackwood Creek, I'm the one who holds the map. Drop a comment and tell me, am I the jerk for not in quote, playing nice in quote, with the neighbors, or is there no price too high for the truth?